Now you're about to hear a soothing bedtime story. Make yourself comfortable, lie down, relax, and let your mind drift away into a world of dreams. Let this gentle adventure slowly and softly carry you into calmness and prepare you for a peaceful sleep. Close your eyes, listen, and enjoy. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe so you can receive a new bedtime story every day. Whiskey Dreams and Dusty Roads. Chapter 1. The Silence of the Plains. Long before the towns and railroads crept into the West, there was only land. Endless, open land under a sky too big to fit into any one man's dream. The kind of land that didn't care if you were tired or hungry or alone. The kind that just kept going until you couldn't remember the last time you saw a tree or heard another voice. Tom Calder rode across those plains the way a man walks through a memory, slow, careful, and always listening for something that might no longer be there. His horse, Dusty, was as worn as he was. Ribs just under the skin, hooves chipped from rocky trails, and eyes that had seen too many dry seasons. There was no sound but the wind, no saloon music, no laughing girls, just the whisper of old grass and the creak of his saddle. Out here, every night was cold, not the sharp bite of winter you know today, but a creeping cold that settled in your bones and stayed there. Blankets helped, but only a little. What helped more was memory of warmer nights, better meals, and people who didn't leave. But memory could be dangerous. It had teeth. They say the West was built on hope and freedom, but it was just as much built on backs broken from labor and hearts broken from loss. Chapter 2. Firewater and Hollow Laughter. The towns that did exist weren't much more than a few buildings huddled together like children in a thunderstorm. One such place was Silver Hollow, a name far prettier than the town itself. Silver Hollow had a saloon, a general store, and a sheriff's office that hadn't seen law in months. The saloon was the heart, if you could call it that. Most nights it pumped a bitter mixture of tobacco smoke, body odor, and bootleg firewater through its cracked wooden walls. They called it whiskey. It wasn't. It was closer to diluted kerosene. But no one complained, not when it helped blur the edges of a harsh life. Tom sat in a corner, his back to the wall out of habit. He didn't come to drink. He came to listen. The stories floating through the smoke were worth more than gold, because in them you found truth, not the kind in books, the kind that smelled like horse sweat and gunpowder. One man laughed about outrunning a debt collector. Another bragged about a shootout he barely survived. None of them smiled when they told it. Their laughter was hollow, like the sound of boots on an empty porch. This was life, not legends, just men trying to forget how hard the day had been and how much harder the next would be. Chapter 3. Dirt Roads and Dried Rivers. Outside Silver Hollow, the land cracked beneath your feet. The rivers were mostly gone, dried to memory. Where fish once swam, now only dust stirred. Tom passed by what used to be a homestead. Fence posts still stood, though the wire had rusted through. A swing hung from a dead tree branch, creaking in the wind its rope fraying like the hope of whoever had built it. The door to the cabin still hung on its hinges. Inside, the hearth was cold, the floor scattered with leaves and mouse droppings. But someone had loved this place once. You could feel it in the way the windows faced the sunset. Whoever they were, they'd tried to make it a home. He sat down for a while, just sat. That's something men don't do enough anymore. Sit and listen to what silence is trying to say. After a while, he got back on his horse, left the place just as he found it. You don't take from ghosts. It's bad luck. Chapter 4. Children of the Wind. There were children out here, too. You wouldn't think it, but they were tougher than the adults. Maybe because they didn't know any better, or maybe because they had to be. Lena was one of them. 9 years old, barefoot, and mean with a slingshot. She could hit a snake between the eyes at 20 paces, lived with her father in a dugout home built into a hillside. Her mother had died in childbirth, and her father never spoke much afterward. But Lena filled the silence with questions, stories, and the occasional song she half remembered from her mama's voice. She didn't have dolls. She had rocks and twigs, didn't have school books, just a Bible missing half its pages, and still she smiled. Not often, but when she did, it was real. Tom met her on a supply run. She asked if his horse was a unicorn. He told her no. She looked disappointed, but then laughed. That kind of laugh that makes the hard days softer. That night, Tom shared his beans with her and her father. They shared their last candle. It was enough. Chapter 5. The Old Man in the Mountains. Far from the nearest town, hidden in the folds of the gray hills, lived old Josiah. Folks said he was crazy, but folks say a lot of things about people they don't understand. Josiah had lived through 3 wars, 4 droughts, and 1 great love. He lost her to sickness one winter and never came down from the mountains again. Built a life out of quiet, raised goats, drank boiled pine bark tea, talked to no one but the stars. Tom stumbled on Josiah's shack during a storm. The rain came down like nails, and the wind screamed like a mother who had lost her child. Josiah opened the door, looked at Tom, and without a word, handed him a dry blanket. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. That night, they sat by the fire and listened to it crackle. Sometimes, words only get in the way. In the morning, Josiah handed Tom a pouch of dried meat. Said only one thing. The world's rougher now than when I came up here. Be softer than it. Chapter 6. A Storm Over Silver Hollow. Storms didn't ask permission. They came like judgment, fast and full of fury. Silver Hollow had seen them before, but this one was different. The clouds rolled in black as sin, and the air felt like it was holding its breath. People huddled inside, in the saloon, in their homes, in the jailhouse that hadn't seen a prisoner in a year. Tom was out helping old Miss Hattie board her windows when the wind took the door off its hinges. It howled through the streets like a hungry ghost. Lightning cracked over the church steeple, and rain flooded the dirt roads until they became rivers. But when it passed, and it always passed, something beautiful remained. A stillness, a scent of sage and wet dust, and the kind of quiet that made you believe in new beginnings. Chapter 7. Letters Never Sent. Tom carried a bundle of letters in his saddlebag, none of them addressed, all of them written in the same careful hand. They were meant for someone long gone, a brother who died in the war, a woman who never waited, a child who'd never been born. He never read them aloud, just took them out on quiet nights and looked at them, as if holding them was enough. Sometimes that's all you can do, hold on to the words you never got to say. One night he built a small fire and burned them, one by one, watched them curl and lift into the sky like prayers. Chapter 8. The Last Ride. Tom didn't plan on staying in Silver Hollow. It was never meant to be more than a stop on the trail, but the land had a way of changing your mind, not with promises, but with patience. He helped mend a school fence, built a new roof on Miss Hattie's barn, started teaching Lena how to ride, bought real whiskey from a traveling merchant and shared it with the men in the saloon, even laughed once. And one morning, just as the sun rose over the eastern hills, he saddled Dusty and rode out. Not because he didn't care, but because he did. Sometimes leaving is the most honest way to stay. Epilogue. Dust settles, but stories don't. Years passed. Silver Hollow became a dot on an old map. The saloon fell, and the general store turned into a post office, then into nothing at all. But Lena remembered. She told her children stories of a quiet man on a tired horse, of storms and songs and kindness without reward. She said he smelled like dust and hope, and that sometimes when the wind blew just right, she could hear his saddle creaking across the hills. And in that way, Tom Calder never really left the West, because stories, the real kind, don't die. They ride on, like dust, like dreams, like the road itself. Chapter 9. The Mule Woman. She came from the south with 2 mules, a dog with 1 ear, and a pack of dried herbs that smelled of pine and sorrow. Folks called her the Mule Woman, though her name was Clara. Nobody knew where she'd come from, and she never said. But people remembered her hands, gentle and calloused, worn like river stones. She stitched wounds with thread made from horsehair and boiled bark for fever, never charged more than someone could give, a sack of corn, a warm blanket, or even just silence. Tom met her outside of Dry Creek when a ranch boy was dying from a snake bite. Clara leaned over him like a prayer and whispered things no one else understood. He lived. That night, she and Tom sat by a dwindling fire. She looked at him and said, "The desert doesn't kill you. It just shows you what's left." And Tom knew. She was running from something just like he was. Chapter 10. The Harmonica Girl. In a forgotten corner of a forgotten town, there lived a girl who couldn't see. Her name was Annie. Her eyes were pale and clouded, but when she played her harmonica, even the crows paused to listen. She lived with her grandmother in a shack held together by hope and bent nails. Her hearing was sharp as a hawk's. She could tell the weight of a man by his footsteps, the mood of a visitor by the air they carried. Tom first heard her playing as he rode through a grove of cottonwoods. The sound floated like river mist, slow, full of ache. He stayed a while, chopped firewood, fixed a leaky roof, taught Annie how to ride bareback by holding the reins and letting her feel the rhythm of the horse. She told him, "I see better than most. I just don't use my eyes." Chapter 11. When the Road Turns Red. Not every soul out there wanted peace. Some men carried only hunger and lead. On a trail toward Salt Fork, Tom rode into the wake of a raid. Wagons burned, bodies left for buzzards. He buried what was left with his hands and a broken shovel. 3 days later, he caught up to them, 4 men with whiskey on their breath and stolen boots on their feet. He could have shot them. They deserved it. But instead, he threw his rifle down and walked into their camp with nothing but a flask of water and a loaf of bread. Told 'em he wasn't a preacher, but he'd seen enough dying. They didn't kill him, didn't thank him either, just took the bread and left the flask. Sometimes the hardest thing in the West wasn't surviving. It was not becoming like the worst of it. Chapter 12. Fire Line. It started with lightning. One strike, dry grass, and wind. Tom saw the smoke before he smelled it. Rode hard to warn the settlers in the basin. Some laughed, some ran. By the time they believed him, it was almost too late. They fought it with wet sacks, with shovels, with tears. The fire roared like a devil unchained. Took barns, took cattle, took lives. Clara helped pull children from burning porches. Annie played music in the church basement to keep them calm. Old Josiah even came down from the hills to dig trenches. When it passed, the land was black. But the people were not broken. They gathered what was left, built again. Fire cleanses, and it scars. Chapter 13. What was lost. Clara disappeared after the fire, left only a small pouch of herbs and a note. "I'm not meant to stay. My road isn't done." Tom searched for her once, found her tracks in the sand and a pressed flower left on a rock. He let her go. Annie's grandmother passed in her sleep one morning when the wind was soft. Annie didn't cry, just played one long note on her harmonica and buried her beside the cottonwoods. Josiah went blind, said it didn't matter. Seen more than enough already. And Tom, he kept writing. Chapter 14. Sunset comes soft. Tom's hair turned gray, his back bent. But Dusty, his old horse, still carried him slow and steady. One night, beneath a canyon wall the color of blood, Tom sat watching the stars. He wrote a letter with shaking hands, not to send, just to write. If you're reading this, I'm probably dust, but don't feel bad. The wind always carries the best of us. Somewhere we belong. The next morning, he didn't rise. Dusty stood watch beside him, still and loyal. The earth took him quietly, like a long breath released. Final chapter. The legend that never tried to be one. They buried Tom under a juniper tree. Lena, grown and weathered, came from Silver Hollow with her sons. Annie played her harmonica. Josiah sat silently, hat to his chest, no speeches, just silence and sun. They didn't carve fancy words into the stone, just his name. Tom Calder. He rode soft, and that was enough. Because out there, in that hard land, kindness is the sharpest tool, and quiet men leave the loudest echoes. Chapter 15. The Stranger with No Story. He came into town without a sound, no announcement, no dust kicked up, no glint in his eye. Just a tall man in a brown coat that had seen better days, his boots worn near to ruin, and his hat drooping from the weight of weather. Folks at Mary's saloon looked up when he entered, but no one said a word. In the West, Silence is its own language, and strangers often speak it best. Tom, older now and slower, was sipping watered-down whiskey, not for the taste, but the heat. He looked at the man, then back at his glass. Something about the stranger felt familiar, though Tom couldn't place it. Maybe it was the limp, maybe the eyes, or maybe it was the way he didn't ask for anything, just nodded at Mary and sat by the window where the light fell soft. 2 days passed before anyone spoke to him. The blacksmith's boy, curious as ever, asked his name. The stranger just smiled and said, "Names don't stick when you ride too long." That night, Tom found him on the church steps, staring at the stars like they owed him something. They talked, slow, broken sentences that hung between them like smoke. The stranger had lost a brother, or maybe a son. He'd left something behind, or maybe he hadn't. But when Tom asked him why he kept riding, the answer came quiet. To forget or to remember. I ain't sure which. Chapter 16. A Horse Named Ghost. No one knew where Ghost came from. He wasn't branded, wasn't saddled, and didn't let anyone get near. Pure white, with eyes the color of river stone and a mane that tangled like prairie grass, he roamed the edges of the valley like a spirit in no hurry. Children whispered stories about him, how he was born from lightning or carried the souls of the dead to the next life. Most adults laughed it off, but no one tried to catch him. Except Annie. She didn't chase him. She just sat near the old creek bed each morning, playing low tunes on her harmonica, soft enough to not scare the wind. And after a while, Ghost came closer, first at a distance, then near enough to drink from the same water. He never let her touch him, but he listened. Tom watched the dance from afar. He knew the feeling, the pull of something untouchable. Sometimes just knowing it's near is enough. When the snows came early that year and a blizzard trapped 3 families near Broken Rock, it was Ghost who led Tom through the white, step by step, like he knew the way better than maps ever could. When they returned, Ghost vanished again. Some things, Tom thought, aren't meant to stay, only to guide. Chapter 17. The Winter That Didn't End. It snowed until the roofs sagged and the wells froze. Wood ran short, food shorter. Fires became sacred, and silence ruled the nights. Even the wolves stopped howling, as if the cold had taken their breath too. Tom and Annie worked every day, hauling wood, breaking ice, delivering broth and bread to those too old or sick to fetch their own. Josiah, now nearly blind, became the town's memory. He sat by the stove and told stories of summers past, his voice a kind of warmth in itself. It was during that winter that the stranger fell ill. Fever took him like a thief in the night. Clara was gone, long since vanished into the hills, and no one else knew how to fight it. Tom stayed by the man's side, wiped his brow, held his hand. For 3 nights the stranger spoke in dreams, names, regrets, prayers, and when he died, he did it quiet, as he had lived. They buried him without knowing who he was, but Annie carved a wooden marker with no name, only a carved circle, like a sun or a wheel, something that never ends. Chapter 18. Clara's Journal. Spring came in mud and thunder. Rivers swelled, roads vanished, but the world smelled like life again. During the first true melt, Tom found a bundle wrapped in oilskin near the base of Elk Tooth Ridge. Inside was Clara's journal, her handwriting rough and fast, pages stained with herbs and blood. She had been north, through Cheyenne country, trading healing for safe passage. She'd saved a baby from fever, lost a man to a bear, and sat with a dying woman who spoke 7 words over and over. Don't forget the ones who don't ask. Tom read the journal slowly over many nights. By lamplight, he heard her voice again, her pain, her grit, her calling. She had walked farther than most men ride and still never found a place that felt like home. At the end of the journal, there was a pressed violet and a note. If this finds you, I'm still walking, still healing, still trying. That's enough for me. Tom closed the book and sat a long while. Enough, he whispered. Chapter 19. Broken Bell. The church bell cracked that summer. Too many years, too many storms. When it fell, no one heard it at first. It was the silence that followed that made people look up. Annie found it lying in the dust like a relic from a forgotten god. Some wanted to melt it down, make tools or trinkets. Others said to bury it. But Annie had another idea. With Josiah's help, they raised it again, not on the steeple, but in the garden behind the church, near where Clara once grew herbs. It didn't ring any more, but it stood, a monument not to faith or fire, but to endurance, to the simple fact of standing still, weathered and cracked, but upright. Sometimes that's enough. Chapter 20. The Boy with a Tin Star. He couldn't have been more than 17, barely a man, and yet wearing a tin star on his vest like it meant something solid. His name was Eli, and he came from a mining town long gone dry, where his father had been sheriff and his mother a school teacher. When the silver veins ran out, so did the people, leaving only dust and echoes. But Eli stayed, said he had a duty to uphold the name stitched into his blood. When he rode into town on a paint pony with eyes too bright and hands too clean, most folks laughed, but Tom didn't. He saw the weight in the boy's shoulders, the kind of burden that doesn't come from years, but from trying too hard to live up to ghosts. Tom watched as Eli tried to hold the peace with soft hands and loud orders. The outlaws who passed through didn't respect him, and neither did some of the townsfolk who'd grown tired of law that meant little. But Eli never wavered. One evening, a drunk pulled a revolver on Annie when she refused him drink. Eli stepped in without hesitation. He didn't shoot. He didn't shout. He walked up slow, hand steady on his belt, and talked the man down with a voice calm as twilight. That night, Tom shared a drink with him. "You don't have to be loud to be strong," Tom said. Eli just nodded, eyes older than his years. And in that quiet exchange, something passed between them. Not mentorship, not kinship, but respect. Chapter 21. The Salt Trail. Every so often men would speak of the Salt Trail, a forgotten path carved by traders, exiles, and those who needed to disappear. No maps marked it, but old Josiah remembered, said he'd walked it once as a boy, carrying his mother's ashes to a high cliff where the wind howled without end. When the drought came and food stores ran thin, it was Josiah who pointed east, saying there was still forage, maybe wild cattle, if someone was brave or foolish enough to follow the salt. Tom, Annie, and Eli set out at dawn, leaving behind a town running on hope and old stories. The trail was harder than any had imagined. Rattlesnakes slid beneath dry rocks, and the sun boiled water from their canteens before noon. They passed bones, cattle, horses, maybe men, and rocks piled into crude markers that told no tales but warned plenty. Annie's harmonica stayed silent. She was saving her breath. At night, the stars stretched out cold and unforgiving, and the wind whispered like a woman too tired to cry. On the fifth day, they found what they didn't know they were looking for: a canyon green with hidden springs, cattle roaming wild and unbranded. They stayed 2 nights, rested their bodies, and marked the path. On the way back, Tom carved a sign into a tree: "For the hungry, not the greedy." And though he never returned, he hoped someone else would. Chapter 22. Letters Never Sent. Tom never spoke much of his past, but that didn't mean he forgot it. In the evenings, long after supper, he would sit by lamplight and write letters, pages and pages addressed to people no longer living or who had long since walked away. One to Lena, telling her he was proud even when he didn't know how to say it. One to Clara, asking if she ever found a place to stop. One to Annie's grandmother, thanking her for giving the girl music, and many more. Some he burned, some he kept in a tin box under the floorboard of his cabin. None he mailed. Annie found the box years later when the floorboards creaked and the roof needed mending. She read each letter like a chapter in a book she hadn't known was hers. Through those pages, she met the man Tom used to be, braver than he looked, softer than he let on. She wept not for what he lost, but for what he tried to hold on to. In those letters, she understood that silence isn't emptiness. It's what people use when there are no words that do justice to what the heart carries. Chapter 23. The Last Rain. That autumn, the sky broke open. Rain came heavy and thick, turning the dirt to soup and washing away a year's worth of dust. Children danced barefoot through the puddles. Crops that had shriveled sprang to life. The bell in the garden rang once, not from hands, but from thunder. It cracked the air like memory. The townsfolk gathered on porches and leaned into the storm like it was a long-lost friend returned. Tom stood in the open, hat off, eyes closed. The water ran down his face like absolution. He thought of Clara and her healing hands, of Ghost and the trail through snow, of Eli with his tin star and Annie's stubborn strength. He thought of Dusty, who now wandered pasture too old to carry him, and Josiah, who passed just before the first drop fell, smiling, whispering, "I knew it had come." When the rain stopped, everything was cleaner, but not new. Nothing ever really starts over. It just begins again from a different place. Chapter 25. The Old Trade. The blacksmith's hands were scarred like old trees struck by lightning. His forge never cooled, not even in summer, and Tom often found himself drawn to the place, watching sparks jump like fireflies each time the hammer fell. They didn't speak much. There wasn't need. The rhythm of work filled in the silence, and what was left unsaid settled like dust in the corners. In the West, not every trade was for money. Sometimes it was for trust. Tom brought elk hides. The blacksmith sharpened his axe. Annie mended a saddle strap, and he repaired a broken kettle. It was a quiet system, older than coins. But as the town grew, people wanted more. Rail came close. Settlers brought wagons full of polished tools and ideas. Some good, some too sharp to hold. The blacksmith refused to modernize. Said a machine couldn't read the bend of metal like a man could. Eventually, people stopped coming. They bought their tools in crates. But Tom didn't. He still came every month, even when there was nothing to trade, maybe out of loyalty, maybe because the fire reminded him of something raw and honest, a world before comfort where every blister had meaning. Chapter 26. Fire Season. The summer heat arrived early that year, and with it came the fires. First, just a spark in the dry grass beyond the orchard, then a full blaze licking the hillside. Winds carried embers like seeds. Before long, smoke hung in the valley like a second sky. Men and women formed lines, passed buckets, beat flames with soaked blankets. Horses screamed. Chickens ran loose. Dusty, old and wheezing, stood guard near Annie's cabin, refusing to move. Tom worked without pause, lungs burning, eyes stinging. He remembered another fire, years ago, the one that took Clara's clinic. This one felt worse, like the land itself was tired of holding back. Eli organized crews. Annie led the children and elders to the riverbed where it was safest. For days, they fought. And when the rain finally came, it wasn't a downpour, just a thin mist, but enough. The fire died slow. What was left was black and silent. A field of ash, broken fences, and one small oak still standing, bent but unburned. They rebuilt. They always did. But fire leaves more than scars. It leaves questions. What could have been saved? What wasn't worth it? And for Tom, it left a kind of hunger, not for food or revenge, but for stillness, something rare as gold in the West. Chapter 27. The Harvest Dance. That fall, when the wheat returned golden and the fruit trees bore heavy, the town gathered for something it hadn't held in years, a harvest dance. Not grand, not polished, just music, food, and laughter under oil lanterns strung from tree to tree. Annie wore a dress patched from old curtains. Eli shaved his beard. Tom even brought out his cleanest shirt, though it still smelled faintly of tobacco and horses. They danced on packed dirt until their boots wore it smooth. A fiddle played songs older than anyone there, and folks sang with voices cracked from dust and time. It wasn't about forgetting hardship. It was about surviving long enough to share joy again. Josiah used to say, "We dance not because life's easy, but because it ain't." Tom watched Annie twirl in the firelight, her eyes bright, her harmonica tucked in her belt like a secret. For a moment, he saw what the town might become, not just a stop on the map, but a home. And though he didn't dance that night, his heart did. Quiet, careful, but certain. Chapter 28. Dusty's Last Ride. Dusty had been slowing for months. His step shorter, breath rougher, eyes dimmer. Tom knew the signs. Knew this trail led one way, but letting go wasn't easy. They'd ridden through snow and heat, through silence and gunfire. Dusty had carried Tom when his legs failed, listened when no one else would. Horses don't speak, but they remember. And Dusty remembered everything. One morning, Tom led him to the meadow beyond town, the one with the river bend and the wild sage. He took off the bridle, let Dusty walk free. The old horse stood a while, then lay down beneath the cottonwood. Tom sat beside him, hand on his shoulder. No words, just the sound of wind through leaves. Dusty didn't rise again. Tom buried him there, marked the spot with a pile of stones. Annie later carved a wooden plaque. He carried more than a man, he carried a life. Tom visited that spot often, not to mourn, but to remember. Some friendships outlive words. They become part of the land. Chapter 29. A Fire Inside. Tom had lived through drought, fire, loss, and silence, but the greatest challenge came not from without, but within. That winter, alone in his cabin, a sickness crept in, not one of body, but of spirit. He woke without purpose, moved without direction. The West had changed, and though he had helped it survive, he wasn't sure he belonged in what it was becoming. Annie saw it, brought food, stories, a broken clock to fix. Eli stopped by with news from the territory. Letters from Clara, somehow still walking, arrived through strange hands. But even then, Tom felt distant, like watching life through frosted glass. One night, he lit the hearth and sat before it, staring into the flame. He thought of the first fire he ever built, the ones he'd fought, the ones that warmed the bones of friends now gone. Fire destroys, yes, but it also gives light, heat, possibility. That night, something shifted. Tom took out paper, wrote again, not to the past, but to Annie, to Eli, to the stranger who might one day find his cabin. He ended the letter with 5 words. Keep writing. It's still worth it. There came a time when mornings no longer required urgency. Tom would wake just as the sun broke the horizon, the sky a palette of lavender and pale gold. He would sit on a porch, coffee steaming in a tin mug, and watch as the world stirred slowly, a rooster crowing in the distance, dew slipping off the leaves, Annie humming softly as she hung laundry in the yard. These were not the mornings of his youth, filled with saddle straps and loaded rifles. They were gentler, quieter, sacred in their slowness. Eli had built a new station house near the chapel, not so much to enforce the law, but to listen when people needed talking. Annie took over the mercantile and stocked it with more books than bullets. The town had shifted just enough to feel new, but not so much that it forgot what had come before. And Tom, he just watched, listened. Sometimes he'd write, not always full letters now, sometimes just a line or two. He kept them in a leather-bound notebook with no title. The dust don't settle where the heart won't. Whiskey ain't warmth, but it fools the bones. She played songs like maps. He didn't write to be remembered. He wrote because stillness is a kind of music, and he was learning the tune. Chapter 31. The Bell in the Garden. One evening, the bell in the garden rang again. Not for danger, not for death, just a breeze. And yet it brought folks together like it always had. They gathered around Tom's porch. Eli, Annie, the children born of people who once arrived with empty pockets and full hearts. Someone lit a lantern. Someone passed a bottle. Annie brought out her harmonica. No one asked Tom to speak, but he did. Slowly, like warming a story by the fire, he talked of Lena's laugh, of Clara's bandages, of Dusty's stubborn hooves. He talked of nights in the cold with only stars for answers, of men who drank spirit stronger than their hearts, of women who healed with words or just stayed when everyone else left. He talked not as a hero, but as someone who lived long enough to see what mattered and what didn't. By the end, the children were asleep in their mother's arms. The wind had died down, And in the hush that followed, someone whispered, "We're still here." Tom smiled, not because it was profound, but because it was enough. Final chapter, The Trail Beyond. Tom left his boots by the door that morning. Didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note, just walked. Past the edge of town, through the sagebrush and cottonwoods, across the creek now swollen from spring. His legs were slower but steady. His eyes saw further but softer. He followed a trail he hadn't taken in years, the one Josiah once called the old road west of memory. No one saw him leave, but folks noticed. Annie found his notebook open on the table, a single line scrawled across the page. "If I don't return, let it be because I finally arrived." Years later, people still talked about him. A stranger would stop in and mention a man who helped fix a wagon wheel in the hills. A writer said he'd seen someone who matched Tom's look, sitting by a fire under the stars, humming a tune that sounded like a memory. Maybe it was him, maybe it wasn't. But the cabin remained. The bell still rang, and the road still waited.